Today we're going to cover sidechaining the mix using the lead vocal. Now, I often get studios sending me stems of a stereo mix, but stems of the vocals separate. Sometimes I get stems of individual groups, so it might be drums, vocals, etc., keys. And sometimes I'll just get a stereo mix. I prefer to have a stereo mix with the vocals separate. That way I can make some adjustments and check against the mix itself whether the vocal's cutting through nicely or not. Let me just play what we've got going here, and then I'll show you how I've created routings and everything.
If I can't have you anymore, can't have you anymore. If I can't.
So that's a very rich vocal line that's already been treated. You can hear the effects on it. Now let me play the music without the vocals. And let me now bring in the vocals. Sounds nice, but the vocal's not really cutting through. So let's sidechain it and send it to the main mix. The first thing we need to do is to understand what's happening here at the stereo out. Ignore this mix for now and ignore everything you see here. Just pretend all these channels are going to the stereo out, which is how all DAWs work. Whether they are running on off auxiliaries or groups, it really doesn't matter. Finally, everything will go through this stereo out. Of course, there are ways of creating different stereo outs, which is what I do whenever I'm mixing. I tend to have 3 stereo outs. I keep one clean like this. And that's usually because I'll have a reference track being played in my DAW, and I don't want that to be affected by whatever's on the master bus here. I'll then create a master bus which is very colored, which is specific to that genre. So if it's EDM, I'll have a whole bunch of things happening on the inserts there. Hip hop will need something different. And then I'll have a third bus, which is the one I use for testing things. Here, we're only going to work with 2 buses. So we're going to have the stereo out, which is the clean stereo out of everything going into it. And this one here, which I've called the mix out. The mix out is a group I've created, and I've routed all the instruments bar the vocals to that group. So if I select any of these and go to routing, you'll see that they're going to the mix. And the reason I've routed to the mix is because I want to hear all the audio going through the mix. I don't want it replicated on 2 separate channels. So either work in groups and then route the group out, or work on auxiliaries whereby you'll end up with 2 sets of sound. So you need to be careful there. For safety's sakes, I'm routing everything bar the vocals, which is going through the stereo outs because I don't want the vocals affected by what I'm about to do to the rest of the sounds. Everything else is going out of the mix, which is the group, and for safeguarding it, I've sent everything to the mix via the group. So that group is now acting as a secondary stereo out. When you go to the group, which is the mix group that I created here, I've inserted a dynamic equalizer, and the one I'm going to use today is the Waves F6. This is a standard dynamic equalizer. All dynamic equalizers behave pretty much the same, in that they'll have a frequency for multiple band selection, Q for bandwidth, gain whether you want it compensated or attenuated, range, which on dynamic equalizers, if you go negative, acts as compression, positive acts as expansion, and there are uses for both. Threshold, because with all dynamic equalizers you need a threshold, an attack and a release. It's in effect, think of it as, well, I could say multi-band compression, but we are a little bit more sophisticated than that. We have a lot more control. For F6 to be triggered by the vocals, we need to first make sure we activate the sidechain here. It'll be different in Logic and PT and what have you. So make sure the sidechain's activated. And then we need to go to the vocal channel and send the vocal channel to the sidechain input at 100%. So make sure it defaults to 0. We want the full signal going in and triggering the dynamic equalizer on the group that's controlling all of these sounds. So let's go in there and have a quick listen. What I'm going to do is put this in solo mode external because we want the external sidechain, and wide. Now, let me explain this very briefly to you. If your sidechain mode is in wide, it means the entire vocal frequency range from that channel that's triggering this will be heard. Split mode means we can actually define it using bands. We can also use split mode for far more effective sidechain control here. Quite often we will use one band set, I don't know, 2 to 4 kilohertz, and make sure that the vocals specific transients that we select, so it might be say at 3 kilohertz, is going to be what triggers whatever the band we select here to attenuate by or expand by. It's up to you. And to help you, let me play it in wideband. You should hear now the full vocal frequency range, irrespective of what I'm doing here.
If I can't have you anymore, can't have you anymore.
And you can see the frequency spread, sort of 260 hertz all the way up. Let's put it in split mode and I'll scan the frequencies.
If I can't have you anymore, can't have you anymore.
Wideband mode, no difference.
Can't have you anymore.
So now we know that sidechain mode can be split or wideband. Wideband if you want the full vocals to come in, split if you want to do slightly more focused work. Internal and external, there's a great distinction between the two. External, if we want an external sidechain trigger, in this instance we have to have external because we've got the vocal line processing this, so this is only triggered when the vocals start to play. Internally is in the event that you want to use the bands here, and let me play them for you.
If I can't have you anymore, can't have you.
So we're now using the internal filtering for the sidechain, but we don't need that, we want external. Solo.
Have you anymore? If I can't have you anymore, can't have you.
So around 3K is what I'd like to work with on the vocals here on the mix. 3K is very pronounced, so I'd like the mix to attenuate at 3K. Now, bear this in mind that you could actually work with more bands, so you're not fixed on working by a single band. But because I'm in wideband mode, I want the whole vocals to trigger this specific frequency range. I'll leave that to wide and external. But feel free to play around with as many nodes as you want and use them in split mode. We need to now make decisions about what settings to use for the whole mix. I'm going to use a very wide EQ now, a very wide bandwidth, and I'm going to go all the way down here for compression because I want you to hear, and I'm going to put this all the way here. This is going to be very extreme, but I want you to hear what happens when I drop out a solo and the vocals start to trigger the mix.
Anymore. If I can't have you anymore, can't have you anymore. If I can't have you anymore, can't have you.
So you could hear how dramatic that was. We will never get to that level. What we would probably do is pick something like this, set my threshold much higher up, because we only want a few dBs here. We don't want anything too dramatic. A little bit of compression. Time your attack and your release so you've got that nice little undulating bump thing going on. Sounds a lot better. It's just giving room for the vocals to just sit through the whole thing. Little tip, if you want to work out what frequency is doing what, just throw it in internal mode and start to move your nodes around. What I tend to do is I tend to boost. This is an old trick, everyone knows this. And scan the frequency. Just there. We weren't far off, to be honest. It's a great way of nailing clarity of vocals through a mix and what have you. It really is a good way. It's also a technique we use to get rid of sibilance. I will locate the sibilance and have that ducked. It's a great way to have DS control over the whole vocal, so it's not just a specific band, but a wider range. It's endless what you can do. It's a great tool that I really do enjoy using. Okay, so that's really how we use it. Very simple. All this is self-explanatory. Treat, attack, release and threshold as you would with a compressor. Be very wary whether you want, and let's just do it just while we're here, expansion or compression. That's obviously extreme expansion, but you get the idea. We get the vocals coming in, we filter the vocals or select what part of the vocals, whether it's split or wideband mode, we want triggering, and we want to be able to define the trigger. Is it expansion? Is it compression? Is it very subtle stuff? Is it extreme? I picked extreme settings to show you how it works. Just be very careful how you route all your signals, because with a mix that's sort of 100 tracks, and I get those quite often, you can get a bit lost going into every track and trying to send it to a group. So I do it right at the start. I set up all my groups and my auxiliaries and just mix and match until I've got the right signals. Thank you very much.